Well, good morning. It's good to be with you as we continue this week looking at the different messianic prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament. I hope you enjoyed yesterday looking at one of my absolute favorite passages in all the Bible, the suffering servant passages in Isaiah 53. It's always is and always will be just one of my favorite passages in all the Bible. I think it's just beautiful and it's informative. It's informative. It's just a wonderful just a wonderful passage in the Bible. So today, what we're going to do the rest of this week is I want to look at a different passage, a different Old Testament prophecy, and then we're going to look at the corresponding New Testament passage that is talking about. So we'll read it. We're reading two passages the next few days, the Old Testament one and then the New Testament one, showing how the prophecy was given and then how it was fulfilled in the New Testament. Real quick thing, though, about prophet. I want to unpack. I've shared this with you before, but talk real quick about what prophecies are in the Bible. And of course, with prophecies, we see this in the Gospels especially, but also in Paul's writings, and honestly in Revelation too. Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels. And so over and over and over again in Matthew's Gospel, you'll see Matthew say, this was done to fulfill the prophecy of such and such and so and so. You see it all over the New Testament, particularly in the very Jewish Gospels and writings. So Paul does it as well. If you remember when we went through Acts not long ago, Paul was always taking the Old Testament and seeing how it pointed to Jesus. And so that's very common. And that's one of the ways that we as Christians read the New Testament differently from our Jewish friends, is we're going to read it looking for Jesus. And I think that's the key to prophecy. Always remember, prophecy has to it in the Old Testament a future telling portion, but not all of the prophecies in the Old Testament are future related. Many of the Old Testament prophecies are about God, about the prophet, the preacher speaking God's word that the people needed to hear in that moment. So much of the New Testament, Old Testament prophecies are future telling, but they are not all future telling. Many of them are based upon what's happening in that moment in the life of the Jewish people. These passages today we're going to read today in the next few days are going to be very future leaning prophecies of what God's going to do. So today we're going to be reading from the prophet Micah, and then we're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. So we're going to read Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and then Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. So reading first from Micah. And you may, when I read the Old Testament passage, you may immediately know where the New Testament is going to go. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephraim, who were one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is to rule Israel, whose origin is from old, from the ancient days. Okay, now going to Matthew chapter 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where's the child who has been born King of the Jews? We observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, "Bethlehem of Judea, for so has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." So we see here in Matthew's gospel, the religious leaders were pointing back to Micah. So Micah, of course, is another prophet from the Old Testament who lived centuries before Jesus. We talked yesterday with Isaiah how far Isaiah was from the time of Christ. We see it here as well, that Micah is a prophet. He's saying that that the Lord's speaking, and there's going to come one from Bethlehem. Bethlehem is one of the smaller little towns in Judea, right outside of Jerusalem, and shall come forth one who's to rule Israel. And I like how it says here in the original writing, whose origins from old, from ancient days. And here it says, they quote it says, "You, Bethlehem in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. That from Bethlehem, this small little village, this small little town, is going to come one who is great and mighty. And so let's compare that with the suffering servant passages yesterday. Remember in the suffering servant passage, it said that there was going to be nothing attractive about him, that he was not going to be one to whom people's eyes would be drawn. We see over again in the prophets and then in the Gospels that Jesus would have been easy to miss. We see this with the wise men. Where did they go to look for the birth of the Messiah? Where did they go? To Jerusalem. They went to the capital city. They went to the palace. They went to the place where they would expect a king to be born. It says, we saw his star rising in the east, so we came to worship him. When they got to Jerusalem, they saw that the Messiah was not there. So they asked Herod, where's the one who's born king of the Jews? And he pulled his religious leaders out, and they went immediately to Micah chapter 5. And they said, oh, in Bethlehem, because it says here in Bethlehem, the one that will be born, the Messiah would come from here. I've always found this story interesting because the wise men who had no knowledge of Micah, no knowledge of the Old Testament, no knowledge of the prophets, they were paying attention. They saw the star rise and they knew to look for Jesus. Yet Herod and the religious leaders, the teachers, the scribes, they had access. They knew immediately. Let's go to Micah. They knew when Herod asked where was the Messiah to be born, the religious scribes went immediately to Micah. They said, oh, it's clear in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Of course, they didn't have verses and chapters back then. They knew immediately what the scroll said, and that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. They knew what the passage said, but they weren't paying attention. So the wise men who didn't know the scriptures were looking and seeing, and they knew the star had risen, and they went looking for the Messiah. But their religious scholars who knew all these things weren't paying attention. Just like Bethlehem would have been easy to miss because the wise men didn't start off there. They started in Jerusalem because that's where they would assume the king would be born. They almost missed it. The religious leaders, even though they knew Bethlehem would be the place, they almost missed it. Are we looking? A little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Are we looking for the Bethlehems in our life, y'all? Are we reading the word so that we can be prepared to encounter Jesus where he is to be? But then are we also paying attention in life? Because you have one group, the wise men, who didn't know the word, so they didn't know where to look. So they went to Jerusalem. On the other hand, you had the religious scholars who had the word, but they weren't looking. We need to do both. We need to be in the word, looking, praying, listening. But then we need to take what we see in the word and look up a little bit. Lift up our eyes to look around to see where Jesus is. Bethlehem would have been easy to miss. Jesus would have been easy to miss. They weren't paying attention. So let's look, y'all. Let's look for Bethlehem. Right here, it says he was to be born there. Right here, we see that fulfilled in Jesus. And that's one of the beauties we're going to see in these coming days, y'all. Over and over and over again, we're going to see Old Testament prophets say, this is the Messiah. This is what will happen. This is where it will be. And over again in the New Testament, we're going to see that fulfilled. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Bible, y'all, is to see this said here and this fulfilled here. So read your Old Testament, y'all. Read your Old Testament. I love the New Testament. Love it. But without the Old Testament, we don't fully know the New Testament. So read your Old Testament too. So, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. The wise men didn't know the Bible, but they were paying attention. And because they heard the word preached, they knew where to go. The religious scholars read the Bible, but they weren't paying attention. So let's do both, y'all. Let's read the Bible. Let's pay attention. I think if we do that, we'll see the Messiah where he is. Thanks for being with us as we unpack these messianic prophecies each day this week. So thanks for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you tomorrow morning.